of antiseptic and baby powder couldn't mask the smell of fear in the room. It was my fear, a cold, metallic tang that caught in the back of my throat. 10 tiny bassinets were lined up against the wall of the private hospital room like a fragile, precious fleet. Inside each one was a miracle, one of my 10 newborn daughters. Their collective breathing was the softest, most beautiful sound I had ever heard. NBUT, the silence from the man standing by the window was deafening. NMY husband, Dr. Alistair Finch, hadn't touched a single one of them. He hadn't held a single tiny hand or stroked a single downy cheek. He stood with his back to us, his hands clasped behind him in his customary, authoritative pose, staring out at the city skyline. He was a renowned geneticist, a man celebrated for his brilliant mind and his groundbreaking work in mapping the human genome. He was a man who dealt in the tangible, the provable, the pure, and he believed our daughters were contaminated. And "I can't, Amelia," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was the same tone he used when explaining a failed experiment to his lab assistants. Physical contact is out of the question. The risk of transference is too high. NHE wasn't talking about a virus or a bacteria. He was talking about me. He was talking about my flawed DNA. You see, my family is riddled with a rare, devastating genetic disorder, a neurological condition that lies dormant for decades and then appears without warning, stealing your memories, your mobility, your very self. It took my mother. It's beginning to take my older sister. I have lived my entire life with the knowledge that I am a carrier, a ticking time bomb. Alistair had promised me he could fix it. He had promised me a family free from the curse that haunted my bloodline. He had used his own cutting-edge experimental gene-editing technology on our embryos. He had assured me, with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed himself a god, that he had scrubbed them clean. He had promised me 10 perfect, healthy daughters. NBUT, on the day they were born, the final genetic sequencing came back from his lab. 9 of them were clean. Perfect, just as he had designed. But one of them, our smallest, whom I had already named Clara, still carried the marker, and in his mind, the entire experiment was a failure. The whole crop was contaminated. He couldn't bring himself to touch any of them, terrified that the flaw was somehow contagious, a metaphysical stain that could spread from the 1 to the 9. He looked at our 10 beautiful daughters and saw nothing but his own failure. NSO, I was the only one. My arms were their only embrace. My touch was their only comfort. I moved from bassinet to bassinet, my body aching from the C-section, my heart shattering into a million pieces. I was their mother, their sole source of warmth in a room that had been turned into a sterile laboratory by their own father. He had created them, but he had refused to love them. And as I looked at his rigid back, a terrifying realization dawned on me. This wasn't just about his disappointment. This was about his obsession with perfection. And what does a man who worships perfection do with what he perceives as a flawed creation? He doesn't nurture it. He contains it, or he eliminates it. NIF, your heart is already breaking. Please hit that like button and subscribe. The story of a mother's fight against a father's cold science is one you need to hear to the very end. And I met Alistair when I was a patient. Not his, but a participant in a long-term observational study for families affected by Huntington's disease, the genetic ghost that haunted my lineage. I was a music teacher, living a life that was deliberately small and quiet, trying not to think about the 50-50 chance that my own mind and body would one day betray me. Alistair was a guest lecturer at the study's annual conference. He was brilliant, articulate, and radiated an aura of such profound confidence that it was almost hypnotic. He spoke about the genome not as a fixed destiny, but as a text that could be edited, corrected, and perfected. He spoke of a future without genetic disease, a future he was actively building. NHE sought me out after the lecture. He said he was drawn to my quote, 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 genetic profile. It was the strangest pickup line I had ever heard, but I was captivated. He wasn't just interested in me, he was interested in my flaw, my curse. But he didn't see it with pity. He saw it as a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be unlocked, and he wanted me to be his partner in solving it. Our courtship was a whirlwind of intellectual fervor. He was handsome and charming, but our connection was based on his obsession with my DNA. He promised me a life I had never dared to dream of, a life with children, a family, free from the shadow of Huntington's. "I can fix this, Amelia," he would say, holding my hands, his eyes burning with an intensity that I mistook for love. "I can give you a clean bloodline. I can give you perfection." And I fell in love with the promise. I fell in love with the idea of a future without fear. My family warned me. "He looks at you like a project, not a person." My sister, who was already showing the early, tragic signs of the disease, told me, "Don't be his experiment." NBUT. I was too deep in his spell. I believed in his genius. I believed in his love. We married, and our life became dedicated to a single goal. The Progeny Project, as he called it. It was years of preparation. He built a state-of-the-art genetics lab in the basement of our sterile modern home. My life was a series of blood draws, genetic sequencing, and hormonal treatments. I was no longer a music teacher. I was a full-time vessel for his ambition. NHE used IVF to create dozens of embryos. Then, using a highly experimental CRISPR technology he had pioneered, he began the painstaking work of editing them, searching for and attempting to eliminate the Huntington's gene. It was his life's work, the project that would make him a legend. When he announced that he had successfully created 10 viable, clean embryos, he was euphoric. 10 perfect girls, Amelia," he said, showing me the data on his screen. "A perfect set. We'll implant them all. The data set will be unparalleled." And I was terrified and thrilled. 10 babies. It was an overwhelming number, but it was also 10 chances at the life I had always wanted. I agreed. The implantation was successful, and my pregnancy was a meticulously monitored, 9-month-long scientific experiment. He treated my body like a precious incubator, my health secondary to the viability of the specimens inside. The man I had married slowly disappeared, replaced by the lead scientist of the project. I was no longer his wife. I was the biological hardware for his greatest experiment. And I was about to find out what happens when a scientist's perfect data gets corrupted. NNTHE, birth of our 10 daughters, was a scheduled, sterile, and highly orchestrated event. A team of specialists, all handpicked by Alistair, performed the C-section. The babies were whisked away to be cleaned, tested, and sequenced before I was even allowed to hold them. I was a bystander at the birth of my own children. Alistair wasn't in the operating room with me. He was in his own makeshift lab, set up in an adjacent room, anxiously awaiting the final genetic data. For him, the birth was not the miracle. The data was, and I was in the recovery room when he came in. He wasn't holding a flower or wearing a smile. He was holding a tablet, his face pale and rigid. "There is an anomaly," he said, without preamble. "Specimen 7B Clara. The edit didn't hold. The sequence shows a positive marker for the HTT gene," and I stared at him, my mind foggy from the anesthesia. "What does that mean, Alistair?" "It means she has it," he said, his voice flat. "The flaw. It's there." He looked up from his tablet, and for the first time, I saw not just disappointment in his eyes, but a cold, burning fury. One failure compromises the entire dataset. The project is contaminated. NTHAT was the moment everything changed. He wasn't a father grieving a daughter's diagnosis. He was a scientist whose perfect experiment had been ruined. When they finally brought the girls to my private room, he refused to enter the space. He stood in the doorway, looking at the 10 bassinets with a look of profound disgust. "I can't go in there," he stated. The integrity of the other 9 could be compromised. Compromised by what? I asked, my voice trembling. "Alistair, it's not contagious. You know that. It's genetic. We don't know what we don't know," he retorted, his voice sharp. "There could be epigenetic transference, a cascading failure. Proximity is a risk I am not willing to take with the viable specimens." NHE was talking about our daughters as if they were petri dishes. 9 were viable specimens. 1 was a contamination. and I, as the original source of the flaw, was the vector. From that moment on, he treated our hospital room like a quarantine zone. He would only speak to me from the doorway. He received updates on the babies, health from the nurses, analyzing their weight and vitals like a detached researcher. He never once asked to hold one. He never once referred to them by the names I had so carefully chosen. They were Specimen 7A, 7C, 7J, and I was left alone in a room with 10 newborns, my body screaming in pain, my heart breaking with every beat. I was their only source of human contact. I developed a system, a rotation of love. I would hold and feed 2 at a time, propped up in my hospital bed, whispering to them, telling them they were loved, that they were wanted. My touch, my embrace, was an act of defiance against their father's cold, clinical rejection. And I would look at little Clara, so tiny and perfect, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, and a wave of fierce, protective love would wash over me. She was not a failed experiment. She was my daughter. They all were. Alistair saw a contaminated data set. I saw 10 miracles. And I was beginning to understand that to save them, I would have to save them from the man who had created them. And bringing the girls home was like moving them from one laboratory to another. Alistair had redesigned our house. The entire top floor, where the nurseries and my bedroom were located, was designated a Level 2 biohazard zone. He insisted I wear disposable gloves and a mask when I was with the babies, and that I shower and change clothes before entering the clean part of the house downstairs where he lived and worked. NHE hired a team of nurses to help me, but they were his nurses, reporting directly to him. Their job was not to help me bond with my children, but to collect data, feeding volumes, sleep patterns, waste output. They were extensions of his research, not a source of comfort for a new mother. NHE never once set foot on the top floor. He would watch the babies on a network of high-definition cameras he had installed in every room, his face on the monitor in the nursery a constant, judgmental presence. He would speak to me through an intercom system, his disembodied voice directing my every move. Specimen 7B is displaying signs of distress. Check her vitals. You are holding 7E improperly. Support her head at a 45-degree angle. NMY life became a surreal nightmare. I was a prisoner in my own home, the sole caretaker in a high-tech prison ward for my own children. My love and touch were the only contraband items, the only unquantifiable variables in his cold equation. I ignored his protocols whenever I could, ripping off the gloves to feel their soft skin, singing the lullabies my mother had sung to me, a legacy of love he would have deemed a contamination. NHI's obsession with Clara was the most terrifying part. He focused on her with a chilling intensity. He had a separate, high-resolution camera zoomed in on her bassinet at all times. He directed the nurses to take blood samples from her every day, searching for something. I need to understand the mechanism of failure. He explained to me over the intercom, his voice clinical. Why did the edit fail on her? What is different about her biology? She is the key to perfecting the next generation of the technology. NHE didn't see a baby. He saw a broken piece of code that he needed to debug. He started talking about isolating her from the others, moving her to a separate room to prevent any potential cross-contamination and allow for more focused study. That's when I knew his obsession was tipping into something truly dangerous. Isolating a newborn baby? For study? The thought was monstrous. He was so detached from their humanity, so blinded by his scientific ambition, that he was capable of anything. He was a man who had tried to play God, and in his failure, he was becoming a devil. And I had to find a way to fight back. But he controlled everything. The house, the staff, the finances. I was as trapped and isolated as my daughters. My only weapon was my knowledge of him, my understanding of the one thing he valued more than anything in the world, his reputation, his legacy as a brilliant, infallible scientist. And I decided I would use that to burn his sterile world to the ground. An NMY plan began with the nurses. They weren't cruel women, just professionals following the orders of their powerful, intimidating employer. I started to talk to them not as a boss, but as a fellow woman, a mother. I let them see my pain, my fear, my fierce love for my children. I started with the youngest nurse, a woman named Maya, whose eyes held a flicker of sympathy. He thinks she's a lab rat. I whispered to Maya one night as we stood over Clara's crib. He doesn't see a child. He sees a mistake he wants to dissect. And I began to plant seeds of doubt. I would ask them questions Alistair would never ask. Who do you think she looks like? Did you hear her laugh today? I humanized my daughters in a way he never could. Slowly, I saw a shift in the nurses' behavior. They started to linger, to offer a comforting word, to touch the babies with a tenderness that wasn't in their job description. I was building a secret army of mothers within the walls of my own prison. My next step was to find an outside ally. Alistair monitored all my calls and emails. I had no way to contact the outside world without him knowing. But he had overlooked one thing: the old-fashioned, analog mail. The nurses were responsible for taking out the trash and the recycling, including the biohazard bags filled with used diapers and gloves. And I wrote a letter. It was a desperate, detailed account of my life, of Alistair's cold cruelty, of his plans to isolate Clara for study. I didn't write it to the police, who would likely see it as a domestic dispute. I wrote it to Dr. Lena Petrova, Alistair's fiercest professional rival. She was a brilliant geneticist in her own right, but her work was guided by a strict ethical framework that Alistair had always mocked as sentimental and unscientific. They had publicly clashed for years. I knew she despised him. And I sealed the letter in a biohazard bag and slipped it into the regular trash. I told Maya that I had accidentally thrown away a sentimental piece of jewelry and asked if she could retrieve the bag and mail the small, sealed envelope I had placed inside. I told her it was a letter to my sister. She looked at me, a silent understanding passing between us, and nodded. And a week went by. Nothing happened. I started to lose hope. Alistair's plans for Clara's isolation unit were becoming more concrete. He was having a room in his basement lab retrofitted. Time was running out, and then, one morning, the doorbell rang. It was a sound I hadn't heard in months. Through the monitor, I saw a group of people at the door. A woman with a severe haircut and an iron will in her eyes stood at the front. I recognized her from photos. It was Dr. Petrova, and she wasn't alone. She was with a team of people, including Child Protective Services and several uniformed police officers. Alistair, furious at the interruption, went to the door. "This is a private residence and a sterile research facility," he boomed. "You are trespassing." NDR Petrova held up a legal document. "We have a court order, Dr. Finch," she said, her voice cutting through his arrogance, "based on credible allegations of unethical human experimentation and child endangerment. We're here for the children." NTHE look on Alistair's face was something I will never forget. It was the look of a god who had just been struck by lightning. His perfect, controlled world was being breached, and his carefully constructed reputation was about to be shattered. The unblinding had begun. An NTHE raid, because that's what it felt like, was swift and efficient. The team from Child Protective Services, guided by Dr. Petrova, swept upstairs into the quote, 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 woat, goat, quote, 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 goat, quote, quote, goat, quote, 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 goat, goat. Not a nursery, but a laboratory. The cameras, the intercom, the isolation protocols. It was a mountain of evidence against him. Alistair tried to bluster his way through it, talking about his groundbreaking research and the importance of sterile protocols. But his words sounded hollow and monstrous in the face of 10 tiny babies and a wife who looked like a prisoner of war. NTHE nurses, led by Maya, corroborated my story. They spoke of his cold detachment, his obsession with specimens, and his chilling plans for Clara. They gave sworn statements that painted a picture not of a concerned father, but of a dangerously detached scientist. NTHE authorities removed the children from the house immediately, placing them in the temporary care of the state at a nearby hospital. I went with them. Walking out of that house, out of that prison was like taking my first breath after nearly drowning. NTHE legal and professional fallout for Alistair was catastrophic. Dr. Petrova, armed with my letter and the evidence from the house, launched a full-scale investigation through the National Board of Medical Ethics. His progeny project, once hailed as revolutionary, was now exposed as a monstrous exercise in ego and unethical experimentation. His funding was pulled, his lab was shut down, and his medical license was suspended. NTHE media storm was relentless. He was no longer Dr. Finch, the brilliant geneticist. He was the monster dad, the lab coat father, who treated his own children like lab rats. The one thing he cherished above all, his pristine reputation, was irrevocably destroyed. He had been decontaminated from the scientific community he so desperately wanted to rule. The custody battle was surprisingly easy. His own words and actions were his conviction. The court granted me sole custody and a restraining order that prevented him from coming within 500 feet of me or the children. He was ordered to pay a massive amount in child support, the fortune he had amassed now being used to support the failed experiment he had despised. And I sat in the courtroom and watched him, a man utterly broken, not by the loss of his family, but by the loss of his status. He had been so terrified of my flawed DNA that he never realized the most dangerous flaw of all was his own, a complete and utter lack of a human heart. Nanamwy New Life began in a place that was the complete opposite of Alistair's sterile mansion. With the help of my sister and the first child support payment, I rented a large, slightly chaotic old house with a sprawling, overgrown garden. It was filled with mismatched furniture, secondhand toys, and the constant, beautiful noise of 10 babies. NTHE, first few months, were a blur of feeding, changing, and overwhelming love. My sister, despite her own progressing illness, was my rock. We built a new kind of family, one based not on genetic purity, but on unconditional love and fierce loyalty. The nurses from the hospital, including Maya, volunteered their time, coming over to help me, to hold a crying baby, to give me a moment to breathe. They had become my village, and I filled the house with music. I sang to my daughters the same lullabies my mother had sung to me. I played the piano, my fingers finding the familiar keys, my own spirit slowly coming back to life. I wanted their world to be filled with art and warmth, a direct antidote to the cold science of their father. And I made a point to celebrate their individuality. They were not a data set. They were 10 unique souls. Lily, the calm one. Poppy, the feisty one. Iris, the curious one. And Clara, my tiny, precious Clara. I worried about her, about the future that her genes held. But I refused to let her be defined by it. I held her a little longer, hugged her a little tighter. I was determined to fill her life with so much love and joy that it would build a fortress around her, a fortress that no disease could ever fully penetrate. Her life would not be a tragedy. It would be a masterpiece of love against all odds. NMY love was the only embrace they had known in the beginning, but I made sure it was not the only one they knew for long. Our home became a haven for friends, for family, for anyone who wanted to hold a baby. It was a house of open arms, and I had escaped a world that worshipped perfection and found the beauty in the flawed, the messy, the real. Alistair had been so afraid of my genetics, of the curse in my blood, but he had been wrong. The real legacy I had inherited from my mother wasn't the disease. It was the ferocious, unyielding power of a mother's love. In years past, the cacophony of 10 babies softened into the symphony of 10 growing girls. Our house was a whirlwind of scraped knees, lost shoes, science projects, and laughter. It was chaotic, it was exhausting, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever known. And I went back to teaching music, starting a small school in my own living room for the neighborhood kids. My own daughters were my first and most enthusiastic students. Each found her own instrument, her own voice. Our house was never quiet, and I loved it. NCLARA grew into a thoughtful, compassionate child with a wicked sense of humor. She knew about her condition. We talked about it openly. We focused not on what the disease might take away one day, but on the joy we could find in every moment now. We participated in fundraisers, we advocated for research, and we lived. We truly lived. And one afternoon, I was sitting on the porch swing, watching my 10 girls play a chaotic game of tag in the garden. They were a tangle of limbs and laughter, a vibrant, living refutation of their father's sterile vision. Lily, my eldest, who had Alistair's sharp eyes but my warm heart, came and sat beside me. "Mom," she said, her voice serious. "I was reading about him online. About Dad, and my heart gave a small pang, but I kept my voice steady." "Oh? He's trying to make a comeback," she said, a note of disgust in her voice. "He's working for some private company in another country, trying to start his project again." I looked at my daughters. I saw their strength, their kindness, their fierce loyalty to one another. I saw Clara helping one of her younger sisters who had fallen, brushing the dirt off her knees. "Let him try," I said softly. "He can try to create perfection in a lab for the rest of his life. He'll never find it."